When the Second World War began in September 1939, the Royal Navy believed it already possessed one of the most deadly and reliable weapons ever built for naval warfare. For almost 20 years, British submarines, destroyers, and patrol boats had trained with one powerful machine, the Mark 8 torpedo. It was not just a weapon. Inside the Royal Navy, it was seen as a symbol of British engineering discipline, experience, and quiet confidence. The Mark 8 was massive and intimidating in every sense. It weighed nearly 1.5 tons and stretched almost 7 meters in length, as long as a full-sized city bus. Inside its steel body was a steam-powered engine that burned compressed air, fuel, and seawater to create extreme pressure. That pressure pushed the propellers fast enough to drive the torpedo through water at nearly 45 knots. At its nose sat a devastating warhead packed with over 340 kilograms of high explosive. One solid hit could rip open a destroyer, split a cruiser in half, or tear the keel from beneath a merchant ship. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, British engineers tested and refined this weapon again and again. They adjusted its depth controls, improved its stability systems, strengthened its engine, and sharpened its guidance accuracy. Trials were conducted in the English Channel, the North Sea, and near British submarine bases. Every improvement added more confidence. By 1939, most British submarine commanders trusted the Mark 8 completely. They believed that if their aim was true, the torpedo would never fail them. And at first, the early months of war seemed to prove them right. In December 1939, only 3 months after Britain had entered the conflict, the British submarine HMS Salmon encountered German warships in the North Sea. In a bold underwater attack, Salmon fired its Mark 8 torpedoes with deadly precision. Within minutes, 2 German cruisers were struck and severely damaged. Across the fleet, patrol reports began to fill British naval headquarters with optimism. Cargo ships were being sunk. Escort vessels were being damaged. The torpedo seemed powerful, accurate, and deadly. British confidence grew stronger with every successful patrol. But that confidence would not last long. In April 1940, Adolf Hitler launched a surprise invasion of Norway. German forces stormed into Norwegian ports and fjords, using troopships, cargo vessels, and heavy warships to seize the long coastline. The Royal Navy reacted immediately. British submarines rushed north into icy waters to hunt German supply convoys as they passed through narrow fjords packed with targets. On paper, this should have been the perfect battlefield. The fjords forced German ships into tight channels. Escape routes were limited. Surprise attacks were almost guaranteed. This was exactly the kind of environment where British submarines expected to dominate. One officer, Lieutenant Commander Bryant aboard HMS Cairn, believed his moment had arrived. Hidden beneath cold, dark water, he maneuvered his submarine into perfect firing position. Through the periscope, he saw a large German cruiser moving steadily through calm seas. The range was perfect, less than 1,000 meters. Bryant ordered a full spread of torpedoes. White trails surged across the water toward the target. The crew waited in silence. The torpedoes reached the ship. And nothing happened. No explosion. No fire. No sound of tearing steel. The German cruiser sailed forward untouched, as if nothing had ever been fired at it. At first, Bryant believed the torpedoes must have narrowly missed. But within days, reports flooded in from other submarines describing the exact same nightmare. Perfect attack angles. Perfect distances. Torpedoes running straight, and no explosions. Some torpedoes struck enemy hulls and failed to detonate. Some exploded far too early. Others passed cleanly beneath enemy ships without triggering at all. By May 1940, frustration had turned into panic inside the British submarine service. At first, many officers blamed bad luck. Then they blamed poor maintenance. Then they blamed faulty manufacturing. But the scale of the failure was impossible to ignore. Successful attacks were becoming rare. Crews were growing angry and confused. Morale dropped sharply. The problem, as engineers soon discovered, was not the torpedo's engine. It was not the warhead. It was not even the guidance system. The problem was the detonator. Before the war, British scientists had introduced a new device that they believed would change naval warfare forever, the magnetic pistol. Instead of detonating when the torpedo physically struck the side of a ship, this new system was designed to sense changes in Earth's magnetic field created by the massive steel body of a passing warship. When the magnetic signal changed suddenly beneath a target, the torpedo would explode beneath the ship's keel, the weakest and most vulnerable point of any vessel. The theory was terrifyingly simple. A blast under the keel would bend the entire hull upward, snap the ship's structural spine, and tear it apart from below. A single torpedo could destroy a ship that once took many hits to sink. In controlled test environments, the results were impressive. Naval designers believed they had created the future of underwater warfare. But real oceans are not laboratories. The waters around Norway were filled with powerful magnetic interference. Ancient granite formations, iron-rich seabeds, and shifting underwater currents distorted Earth's natural magnetic field. These disturbances completely confused the torpedo's sensors. Some magnetically guided torpedoes detonated more than 100 meters before ever reaching their targets. Others passed directly under ships without detecting anything at all. Within weeks, British submarine attacks were failing at an alarming rate. Instead of sinking German warships, torpedoes were exploding uselessly in open water or sliding harmlessly beneath their hulls. By June 1940, after the evacuation of British forces from Norway, the Admiralty was forced to accept a painful and shocking truth. Britain's most advanced torpedo feature, the magnetic detonator, had completely failed in real combat. Out of every 10 attacks, barely 3 resulted in successful detonations. Submarine commanders were furious. One captain wrote in his combat report that he trusted his periscope more than his torpedoes. Another stated bitterly that he would rather ram an enemy ship than rely on the magnetic pistol ever again. Senior officers began sending angry messages to naval headquarters demanding immediate action. The Admiralty had no choice. The magnetic detonator was disabled across the entire fleet. Every British torpedo was ordered to return to simple contact-only explosions, the same basic impact system used during the First World War. Technically, the weapon still worked. But something invisible had been lost. For the first time in decades, British officers doubted their own naval engineering. A quiet fear spread through the submarine service: if this system had failed so badly, what else might be wrong? What if their greatest weapons were not as reliable as they had believed? And while Britain struggled with these doubts, events across the Atlantic were already moving toward a far greater torpedo disaster. Because only 1 year later, a new ally would bring a new torpedo into the war. And with it, one of the worst weapons failures in naval history. By early 1941, Britain was fighting not just a war, but a race against starvation. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. Entire convoys vanished into the Atlantic. Food, oil, weapons, and aircraft were all crossing the ocean under constant threat. If the supply lines collapsed, Britain itself could be forced to surrender without a single soldier landing on its beaches. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States was still officially neutral. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood one critical truth: if Britain fell, America would one day face the full power of Nazi Germany alone. So the United States began helping Britain quietly, carefully, and massively through a new system called Lend-Lease. Under this program, America did not sell weapons. It loaned them for the defense of democracy. In March 1941, 50 aging American destroyers arrived at Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy's main base in Scotland. These ships had been built during the First World War and left in reserve for decades. Now they were desperately needed for convoy escort duty. In exchange, the United States received rights to build military bases across the British Empire. But the ships were not the most important cargo they carried. Deep inside their holds were America's main submarine weapons. The Mark 14 torpedoes. On paper, the Mark 14 looked like the future of underwater warfare. It was slightly shorter and faster than Britain's Mark 8. Instead of using steam, it ran on a modern propulsion system powered by alcohol fuel and compressed air. This meant fewer surface bubbles and a hard-to-detect wake. It carried a 290-kilogram warhead, slightly smaller than the British one, but still powerful enough to destroy most ships with a single hit. And most importantly, it used a magnetic exploder. While Britain had just disabled its own failed magnetic systems after the Norway disaster, the United States still believed strongly in this technology. American engineers were completely confident that their version had solved the problems the British could not. British officers were not convinced. After what had happened in Norwegian waters, the Royal Navy no longer trusted magnetic detonators at all. They agreed to accept the American torpedoes, but only after strict testing under British supervision. For this critical task, the Admiralty selected HMS Vernon. Located at Portsmouth, Vernon was the hidden brain of Britain's underwater warfare program. For more than 60 years, every British torpedo, mine, and underwater weapon had passed through its laboratories. If a torpedo worked, Vernon proved it. If it failed, Vernon exposed it. In May 1941, the first shipment of American Mark 14 torpedoes arrived at Vernon. At first, everything looked perfect. The engines ran smoothly. The gyroscopes kept perfect directional stability. The speed matched American performance claims. The warheads, fuses, and fuel systems all passed initial inspection. For a moment, some British officers wondered if this time, at last, a magnetic torpedo system actually worked. Then the real tests began. Vernon engineers carried the torpedoes out to sea for live depth-running trials. Each torpedo was carefully programmed to run at a specific depth. Some were set for 3 meters. Others for 4 or 5. The first torpedo was recovered after the test. It had not run at 3 meters. It had run at 6. The second torpedo was recovered. It was supposed to run at 4 meters. It had run at 7. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth torpedoes all showed the same terrifying pattern. Every single Mark 14 was running around 3 meters deeper than its settings. This was not a minor calibration issue. This was a lethal design failure. A surface submarine sits high in the water. A merchant ship's keel is also shallow. If a torpedo runs too deep, it does not strike the ship. It simply slides harmlessly underneath. Commander Hugh Haggard, the senior torpedo testing officer at Vernon, ordered the tests repeated. Again and again, the same results appeared. No matter how the depth controls were adjusted, the torpedo always ran far deeper than commanded. The engineers were stunned. They disassembled the torpedoes piece by piece. And then they found the truth. The U.S. Navy had calibrated its entire depth control system using freshwater lakes inside the United States. But seawater is denser than freshwater. This meant the pressure readings inside the torpedo were completely wrong once it entered the ocean. The sensor believed it was running shallow, while in reality it was sinking dangerously deep. This meant one shocking and horrifying fact. For nearly 10 years, since 1931, the United States Navy had been training and preparing for war with a torpedo that physically could not hit shallow targets reliably. No secret enemy sabotage. No battle damage. Just flawed testing. Commander Haggard prepared an official report for the Admiralty. His conclusion was brief and devastating. The Mark 14 torpedo, in its present state, is unsuitable for Royal Navy service. But the disaster was not finished yet. Because the depth error was only the first layer of the nightmare. The British now turned their attention to the most feared device of all. The American magnetic exploder. So far, the Mark 14 had failed in silence. What came next would fail in fire. By the summer of 1941, HMS Vernon had already proven one deadly truth: the American Mark 14 torpedo could not even run at the depth it was set to. But British engineers knew something even more dangerous still remained untested. The magnetic exploder. This was the very heart of America's confidence. The device was designed to detonate beneath an enemy ship rather than on impact. Instead of punching a hole in the side, it would explode under the keel, snapping the ship's spine in half through violent pressure shock. On paper, it was devastating. In theory, it could sink even the largest warship with a single detonation. But Britain had already walked this road. In 1939 and 1940, British submarines had used their own magnetic pistols during the Norwegian campaign. The result had been humiliating. Torpedoes exploded too early. Some exploded too late. Many exploded for no reason at all, sometimes even the moment they left the submarine tube. The Royal Navy had switched off magnetics completely. Now the Americans insisted theirs was different. It was not. In June 1941, Vernon prepared a carefully controlled magnetic detonation test. The target was an old steel pontoon anchored securely offshore. A Mark 14 was fired beneath it at controlled depth and speed. Every instrument on board the observation vessel was ready. The torpedo passed under the pontoon. Nothing happened. No explosion. No pressure wave. No detonation of any kind. A second torpedo was launched. This time, halfway to the target, something terrifying occurred. The Mark 14 suddenly detonated in open water, nearly destroying the test boat observing it. This was the worst possible result. One torpedo refused to explode. The other exploded when it should not have. Engineers now began to suspect the same invisible enemy that had cursed British torpedoes 2 years earlier. Earth's magnetic field. Near the equator, Earth's magnetic field is relatively weak and horizontal. But near the North Atlantic, it grows stronger and steeper. The American exploder's sensors had been calibrated for tests conducted in lower latitudes and controlled environments. Once placed into the powerful northern magnetic zones of the Atlantic, the exploder was being triggered by the planet itself. Meaning a submarine commander could press the firing button and never know whether his torpedo would explode early, explode late, explode not at all, or explode beneath his own boat. In July 1941, Vernon compiled its full magnetic exploder analysis and submitted it to the British Admiralty and the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ordnance. Its verdict was absolute. The American magnetic exploder is operationally unsafe. The response from the U.S. Navy was immediate and hostile. American authorities rejected the findings. They argued that British test conditions were flawed, that British engineers lacked experience with American design philosophy, that the failures were likely caused by improper handling. Behind closed doors, national pride had taken control. The Mark 14 was America's most advanced torpedo. Billions of dollars had been invested. Careers had been built upon it. Entire doctrines depended on it. Admitting failure now would mean admitting a decade of strategic delusion. So the warnings were quietly ignored. And then Pearl Harbor happened. On December 7, 1941, the United States entered the Second World War in fire, smoke, and shock. Overnight, American submarines were ordered into full-scale combat across the Pacific. Their mission was clear: sink the Japanese merchant fleet, strangle Japan's industry, starve its war economy to death. The weapon they carried into battle? The same flawed Mark 14 torpedoes. Within weeks, American submarine commanders began reporting something impossible: perfect firing positions, ideal ranges, clear targeting solutions. Torpedoes were hitting Japanese ships and not exploding. Commanders filed combat after action reports describing torpedoes striking hulls at perfect angles and simply bouncing off like scrap metal. In some cases, sailors on deck could hear the impact echo through the water, followed by silence. Other torpedoes exploded too early, throwing huge columns of water into the air well ahead of the target. Japanese ships saw the splashes and easily maneuvered away. Worst of all were the circular runs. Some Mark 14s curved back toward the firing submarine itself. More than one American submarine narrowly avoided being sunk by its own torpedo. By early 1942, losses were spiraling. Submarines were returning to base with empty torpedo racks and no confirmable sinkings. Crews whispered that their weapons were cursed. Senior commanders were furious, but Washington blamed the submariners. They were accused of poor aim, cowardice, bad tactics, nervous imagination. Admirals insisted the Mark 14 was flawless. Meanwhile, in Britain, the reports coming back from the Pacific sounded horrifyingly familiar to Vernon's engineers. They already knew what was wrong. It took 20 months of combat failure before the US Navy finally accepted what British testing had proven in 1941. In late 1943, the magnetic exploder was officially disabled across American submarine forces, just as Britain had done 3 years earlier. Then the depth mechanism was recalibrated for seawater pressure. Then the contact detonators were redesigned. Only then did American submarine warfare truly awaken. And when it did, it was devastating. From late 1943 to 1945, US submarines destroyed over 60% of Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off oil, steel, food, and ammunition. The Japanese economy slowly suffocated beneath the waves. But every one of those victories came years too late. Back in Britain, HMS Vernon quietly closed the Mark 14 file. The weapon judged unfit in 1941 had cost the United States 2 full years of ineffective submarine warfare. Without Vernon's warnings, the disaster lasted even longer. And without Britain's painful early failures, the Americans might never have fixed the Mark 14 at all. What looked like a simple weapon, a steel tube with a propeller, had shaped the early years of the naval war more than any battleship ever could. Invisible failures, silent explosions, and thousands of lost opportunities beneath the sea. The torpedo had become the most treacherous weapon of the war. Not because it struck the enemy, but because it betrayed its own masters. By late 1941, the Royal Navy had reached a brutal conclusion: torpedoes were either the most powerful weapons at sea, or the most expensive failures ever built. After abandoning magnetic detonators and rejecting the American Mark 14, Britain was forced to return to its own designs and rebuild its underwater warfare doctrine almost from scratch. Unlike the Americans, the British Admiralty no longer trusted theory. They trusted only one thing now: live fire. Every new torpedo design would be tested in the open ocean. Every detonator would be fired against real steel. Every depth setting would be verified at combat speeds. No laboratory success would be accepted without battlefield proof. At the center of this transformation stood HMS Vernon. By 1942, Vernon had become a war factory hidden behind brick walls and secrecy. Engineers worked day and night refining the British Mark 8 torpedo, the same weapon that had already proven brutally reliable during early submarine actions. The Mark 8 was not elegant. It used steam propulsion that left a visible wake. It was slower than newer designs. It was heavier and louder in the water. But it had one priceless quality: it exploded when it hit. And in war, that was everything. British engineers began an aggressive upgrade campaign. New contact pistols were reinforced using shock-resistant alloys. Warheads were reshaped to improve underwater blast transfer. Fuel systems were simplified to eliminate misfires. Instead of chasing futuristic magnetic technology, Britain chose controlled brutality. At the same time, Britain turned its focus to a weapon even more terrifying than the torpedo itself: the depth charge. Before the war, depth charges were crude barrels thrown over the side of ships with little accuracy. By 1942, Britain transformed them into precision underwater bombs. The Hedgehog system was born. Instead of dropping charges blindly behind the ship, Hedgehog launched a pattern of small explosive projectiles ahead of the escort vessel. If one struck a U-boat directly, it exploded on contact. No sonar disruption. No guessing. No waiting. For the first time in the Atlantic, submarines were being hunted instead of the other way around. Convoys that had once traveled in terror now moved inside floating fortresses of escorts, corvettes, and destroyers. Flower-class corvettes, cheap, uncomfortable, and slow, became the backbone of Britain's anti-submarine shield. And slowly, the tide began to turn. While American submarines were still struggling with faulty Mark 14s in the Pacific, British escorts were destroying U-boats in growing numbers across the Atlantic. In May 1943 alone, Germany lost 41 U-boats. More than any other month of the war. For Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's submarine fleet, it was a catastrophe. For Britain, it was salvation. But one more challenge remained. The Germans had developed a new torpedo that terrified Allied sailors. The T-5 Zornkönig. This was the world's first acoustic homing torpedo. Instead of running straight, it listened for the sound of a ship's propellers and turned toward the noise automatically. Destroyers that tried to chase U-boats suddenly found themselves being hunted instead. British ships were being struck amidships without warning. Panic spread. Once again, Vernon went into emergency mode. British engineers raced to create a counterweapon with nothing but days to spare. Their solution was as brilliant as it was simple. They built the Foxer. The Foxer was not a weapon at all. It was noise. Large steel noisemakers were towed behind destroyers, deliberately producing a louder acoustic signature than the ship itself. When a German T-5 torpedo detected the strongest noise, it locked onto the Foxer instead of the ship and exploded harmlessly in the ship's wake. The balance shifted again. German homing torpedoes became almost useless overnight. By 1944, Britain had achieved what no navy in history had done before. Total underwater battlefield control. U-boats could no longer surface freely. They could no longer attack in daylight. They could no longer escape detection reliably. The Atlantic had become an Allied ocean. But the torpedo story still had one last chapter. Across the world, Japan had built the deadliest torpedo of the entire war. The Type 93 Long Lance. Powered by pure oxygen instead of compressed air, the Long Lance had unmatched range, speed, and explosive power. It left almost no visible wake and struck with devastating force. It was the weapon that annihilated Allied fleets at battles like Savo Island and Java Sea. For years, American and British intelligence underestimated it. They paid in blood. But Britain learned from every disaster. Captured Japanese torpedo fragments were shipped to Vernon. Engineers studied their engines, exhaust systems, and oxygen management valves in microscopic detail. What they discovered reshaped post-war torpedo design forever. After 1945, almost every major navy in the world abandoned steam torpedoes and adopted oxygen-based propulsion inspired by the Long Lance. But unlike Japan, Britain made one crucial change. They added safety. No more uncontrolled oxygen explosions. No more unstable combustion systems. No more weapons that endangered their own crews. By the time the war ended, Britain had not built the fastest torpedo. Not the stealthiest. Not the longest range. But they had built the most reliable underwater weapons system on Earth. And reliability, after 6 brutal years of betrayal by faulty weapons, was the only victory that truly mattered. In the silent depths of the Atlantic, torpedoes had once failed, lied, and murdered their own crews through error and arrogance. But by war's end, they obeyed again. And the ocean itself had finally chosen a side. By 1945, the oceans of the world were silent at last. The Atlantic no longer echoed with the explosions of depth charges. The Pacific no longer burned with the wrecks of shattered fleets. For the first time in 6 years, the torpedo war had ended. But its consequences were only just beginning. In the ruins of Europe and the scorched waters of the Pacific, naval officers and engineers sat down to write the most painful reports of the war. Not about heroism. Not about strategy. But about failure. The war had revealed something terrifyingly simple. The most advanced weapons in the world had nearly collapsed entire campaigns because of arrogance, secrecy, and untested theory. Nowhere was this lesson clearer than in the story of the Mark 14. After the depth errors, the magnetic exploder disaster, and the broken contact pistols were finally corrected in 1943, American submarines suddenly became lethal. By 1944, Japanese merchant shipping was being annihilated. Oil stopped flowing. Food stopped moving. War industries starved. By 1945, Japan's economy had been strangled from beneath the waves. But the cost was brutal. American submariners later learned that for nearly the first 18 months of the Pacific War, their attacks had failed not because of poor tactics, but because their weapons had betrayed them. Thousands of torpedoes had been fired, hundreds of perfect attack solutions wasted, and countless enemy ships that should have been destroyed sailed on to fight again. The Royal Navy studied these failures with cold precision. Britain's engineers reached one conclusion that would reshape naval warfare forever. No secret weapon is ever allowed to remain untested in combat conditions again. No matter how powerful it looks on paper. No matter how impressive the theory. After 1945, every major naval power adopted this philosophy. Open testing. Real war simulation. No blind faith in engineering promises. The Cold War began not with missiles, but with torpedoes. Anchor the birth of the Cold War underwater arms race. As the world divided between East and West, the oceans once again became battlefields, only now the enemy was invisible, nuclear-armed, and unstoppable. Submarines became the most feared weapons platforms in human history. And torpedoes became their claws. Britain, America, and the Soviet Union poured vast resources into underwater warfare. Now the goal was no longer just to sink ships. The goal was to kill submarines before they could launch nuclear weapons. The new generation of torpedoes used wire guidance, active and passive sonar, computer-controlled homing, multi-stage proximity detonators. But the ghosts of World War II never vanished. Every new torpedo was haunted by the Mark 14, by the Norwegian magnetic failure, by the contact detonators that jammed and refused to fire. Engineers now built redundancy into everything. If one detonator failed, another would trigger. If guidance malfunctioned, backup systems switched on. If acoustic tracking failed, magnetic systems took over, but this time properly tested. Reliability became more important than power. And Britain, shaped by betrayal and survival, remained obsessed with one principle above all others. A weapon that fails once is already dead. Crossed swords. Japan's Long Lance, from terror to blueprint. Among all the torpedoes of World War II, none left a deeper scar on naval thinking than the Japanese Type 93 Long Lance. It had humiliated Allied fleets in 1942. It had destroyed cruisers in seconds. It had turned night battles into slaughterhouses. After the war, captured Long Lance engines were dismantled and studied across the world. Engineers were stunned by its oxygen propulsion system, dangerous, unstable, yet unbelievably powerful. The Japanese had dared to risk everything for speed and range. And it had worked. But it had also killed their own crews in explosions and toxic fires. Post-war navies took the lesson without the madness. They copied the performance. They rejected the danger. The result was the birth of the modern high-speed, long-range torpedo used today. War to wave the men who were never honored. The torpedo war created heroes whose names were carved into history. But it also created thousands of forgotten victims. Submariners who fired perfect shots that never detonated. Destroyer crews who trusted faulty depth charges and paid with their lives. Engineers who warned of defects but were silenced by bureaucracy. Men died not because of enemy fire, but because someone ignored a test result. Because someone protected a reputation. Because someone believed theory more than reality. In later years, American naval inquiries quietly admitted the truth. The Mark 14 had never been combat tested before Pearl Harbor. Never. It had been approved through paperwork alone. This single decision may have cost the lives of more Allied sailors than any single enemy weapon in the early Pacific War. It was the greatest engineering failure in U.S. naval history. And it was almost erased from public memory. The ocean's final judgment. Today, deep beneath the waves, the silent wrecks of ships still rest on the seabed. Many were sunk by torpedoes that worked perfectly. Others were struck by weapons that failed once and succeeded later. Steel hulls lie rusting in darkness, witnesses to both human skill and human arrogance. The ocean remembers what nations forget. It remembers. The The Norwegian magnetic explosions that failed. The Mark 14 that ran too deep. The contact pistols that jammed on impact. The long lance that turned night into fire. And finally, the moment when engineers learned humility. Checkered flag, the final truth of the torpedo war. World War II proved that battles are not decided only by courage or numbers. They are decided by testing, truth, failure, correction, and humility before reality. Torpedoes were not just weapons. They were teachers. They taught navies that blind faith in technology is as deadly as the enemy. They taught that secrecy can rot design. They taught that arrogance sinks fleets. By the time the Cold War began, every major navy carried the scars of those lessons. And because of those scars, the world survived the underwater nuclear standoff without a single torpedo-triggered apocalypse. The war beneath the waves ended once. And thanks to what it taught, it was never allowed to begin again.